Amy, would you like to get us started?
Yes, and I will say I'm very excited to be here too. I've been a big fan of this community, so it's cool that we get to present. So yeah, rental affordability in Chicago. Half of Chicago households are renters. And if you are a renter, you know that in the last couple of years, Chicago has become more expensive. Rents have gone up. It's well documented that that is the case. Um, but we kind of came to this project and this story in a funny way where we started with data instead of starting with this question of whether Chicago is less affordable today than ever before. We'd kind of stumbled across this really interesting historical data set that we'll talk about later. But once we saw kind of historic information about rents, that kind of got us wondering, is Chicago truly more unaffordable today than it was? And surprise, surprise, the answer is yes. We are answering it in a couple of different ways, though, and in very particular ways. So I think the most int well, so how I'll kind of organize this presentation is we'll kind of briefly just like go through the findings of the story. We'll talk about the source of the data, how we crunch the numbers, and then Angela will give a deep dive into the interactive and do a little demo. Um, so I think the main finding or the most surprising finding for us was that for the first time in nearly a century, a family that makes the citywide median income, so that's about $75,000 in 2022, um, couldn't afford rent in a majority of rentals in 7 community areas in Chicago. And this is pretty significant because basically for the past century before, that same family, whether it's in 1950, 1980, 1990, could afford the majority of rentals in every single community in Chicago. So overall, Chicago is becoming uh, more unaffordable, but not just for, lower income Chicagoans, but for people kind of in the middle of the income spectrum. Um, yeah, the next slide after this. So the next question was why? And there are obviously a lot of reasons for why rents are rising faster than incomes. It depends on who you ask, right? But we talked to a number of different sources, and I think the consensus was that rents are rising 3 times faster than incomes, have risen 3 times faster than incomes in the last 20 years. Of course, it's a different conversation to think about why incomes have risen so slowly, but we focused most of the analysis on why rents have risen so fast. And one is that, yeah, new construction has lagged demand for over the last decade. And this chart, I think, was one of the most telling charts. This is a chart of residential building permits in the Chicago metro area. And as you can see, there's this steep drop after the Great Recession. And that's because a lot of builders kind of just left the sector altogether after the Great Recession, and building activity has not caught up. And so we're seeing a lack of enough supply for the past 10 plus years, and that kind of compounds. The second major kind of reason we found that rents have risen faster is the loss of a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing. And so Chicago, this is, your kind of classic 2 to 4 flat. They are typically, older buildings with more affordable rents. And depending on what area of the city you live in, if you're living in a gentrifying kind of north side neighborhood, a good share of those apartments are getting deconverted into single family homes. And so you're losing, the 3 other rental apartments in that unit. And then in South and West Side neighborhoods, what we saw is that a lot of those naturally occurring affordable housing units were getting demolished, left vacant, disinvested in. And so you're also kind of losing supply in that sense. And then the third reason we included after we talked to some housing organizers is that in Illinois, there is a current ban on any sort of rent control. And this ban was passed, 20 or 30 years ago. And there's been a couple of different efforts to try to repeal this ban, but they've so far been ineffective. And essentially, this means that property owners, landlords, they can there's no limit to how much they can raise your rent year to year. And what this housing organizer told us, he works in Albany Park, is that every year, and especially now, he's heard from a number of tenants calling him when their lease renewal comes up, and they ask him if it's legal for their landlords to raise their rent $200, $500, and unfortunately, the answer is yes, because there is no rent control in Illinois right now. Um, so this is what I alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, which is kind of the source of inspiration for this project, which is our data source. So we've collected over about 100 years worth of rental data, specifically median rent data for every Chicago community area. And so there's 77 Chicago community areas. There were 75 a couple decades ago, but it's funny because the next week's presentation is probably going to touch on this. But these are geographic areas that have not changed since they were created in the 20s and 30s. And so to have median rent data, essentially the same data for this entire period of time, allows us to very directly see change over time. As many of you know who work with data, like census boundaries change, political boundaries change, and that makes it difficult to compare things over time. So the data that we found was in these Chicago local community fact books. And essentially, they are physical volumes. There's a volume for almost every decade going back to 1930 and through 2003 that track a variety of different demographics, vital statistics, housing statistics about the community areas in Chicago. And these are just kind of screenshots of the preface of, I think this is the 1950 fact book. It's created by a number of local governmental agencies, compiled from data on census tracts from the census. And it's interestingly enough, in different years it differs, but it's funded in part by a couple of news organizations. If you see on that second screenshot, it's funded, this one in particular is funded by the Chicago Sun-Times, the Chicago Tribune, and the Chicago Daily News. But we kind of stumbled upon this data set when I was working on a different story about like migration patterns. And I went to the Harold Washington Library and asked the librarian on the fourth floor to pull just any sort of historical statistics they had on race and ethnicity of immigrants. And one of the things that he pulled for me was this 1950 fact book. And flipping through the pages, we actually discovered there's a whole lot of really great information in here, including the median rent information by community area. So if you go to the next slide, you can kind of see an example of what this looks like. On the left-hand side here, there's a table of each community area. It's really small text, I apologize, but there's information about the total number of households and families. There's information about different aspects of the housing units in each of these community areas. And the one that jumped up to us was the median rent. Of course, there's also information about median household value, number of bedrooms. And initially, when we came across these books, we had a team of, it was me, Angela, and our fellow at the time, Jessica Gomez. We had actually taken a trip to the U Chicago Regenstein Library because they held a complete collection of all the kind of volumes across the decades. It's also available at the Harold Washington Library, but I think it wasn't as complete. So we went to Chicago and pulled all these books, which you weren't allowed to check out either. So you had to kind of inspect them at the library itself. And initially, we were going to try to essentially use OCR, optical character recognition, to scan or take photos of each of these books, every single page, and try to extract the data programmatically. But we ran into a lot of issues. Number one, cost. There were, Adobe Acrobat. There's another software called Abby Fine Reader. They were pretty costly for us, and so we didn't have that in our budget. And so we looked to free tools. So we were looking at PyTesteract, which is a open source kind of Python-based OCR package. We also looked into using Google Document Cloud to use to create like an AI model that would kind of extract information from forms. But with that, none of the options really were able to cleanly extract the information. And also, the tables were just so different year to year. They had different formats. And we also didn't have enough volume to train any sort of model because for any given year, we would have just a couple of summary pages. So what we ultimately decided to do is try the most low-tech solution, which is manual data entry. And we chose to be really specific with what data we collected. So we collected a couple of other columns of data, but we mostly collected median rent data and took pictures of every single page just to make sure we could, fact check things on the back end. So I guess this is kind of an open question for later, is if anyone has any suggestions for OCR or any way to kind of digitize these types of things en masse, we'd love to hear them, because I think these are a really valuable resource for the city of Chicago to have in digital format. The other data sources we used for this story were, I guess, more modern data sources. So we did partner with the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning and the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul. And they essentially provided us with rental information from 2000 onwards. So that's where the data for 2000, 2010, and 2022 for median rent by community area came from. Because essentially the rental information that the census tabulates, the smallest geography is the census block and census tract, and those don't necessarily neatly map into community areas. And so there's a little bit of like statistics and weighting that you have to do to get them to fit. The other apologize, that's my cat. The other kind of more modern data set we used was IPUMS, which I'm not sure if this crowd is familiar with census microdata, but essentially the US Census publishes kind of tables of census data in aggregate. You can't really customize these tables though. And so IPUMS publishes census level data at the individual level. And so you can kind of slice and dice census data in different ways that you wouldn't necessarily have available to you if you were just pulling census data. So one example of IPUMS-based data analysis we did for the story is we wanted to know how many renters in a particular income band were paying more than 30% of their income towards rent and utilities. And so that wasn't really a question we could answer with the census. So we turned to IPUMS to kind of filter and essentially group information about how renters. Oh, thank you for the link. And we applied, the income bucketing, and then we found how many of them were paying more than 30%. So happy to talk more about iPhones if anyone has any questions, but it's a really great resource if you're interested in any kind of demographic type of question. So people sources. For this story and for a lot of data stories, we really try to find a person that represents what the data is telling us. And so for this story, we actually initially were interested in a particular neighborhood in the South Loop, which you'll see in the demo that Angela gives, just experienced a really wild swing in how expensive it was. It was one of the least expensive neighborhoods 20 years ago, and now it's one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Chicago. But we were having trouble finding people in just such a specific geographic area. One thing we did is that we were lucky to have an audience engagement team at WBEZ, and they're oftentimes in touch with thousands of people across the city through surveys, through listening sessions. And so the first thing we did was we asked them to provide us they have an Airtable database of pretty much everyone they've come in contact with, and with information on their zip code, their race and ethnicity, and kind of what topics are important to them. So we did filter for the South Loop zip code, and we filtered for people who cared about housing or viewed housing affordability as a top issue. And we were having trouble kind of getting in contact with people that way. So we cast a wider net. We just said, let's just try to call everybody who listed housing affordability as a top issue. And one of the first people that I called who picked up immediately was the main character of our story, LaTanya Robinson, who's pictured here. And we were initially like, okay, like we're gonna have LaTanya Robinson, we're gonna have someone else from a different neighborhood and a third person from a third neighborhood. But her story was so compelling that we decided to just focus on her. So just a little bit about her. She's a 33-year-old single mom. She's been looking for a place to rent for more than 2 years now. And she makes, about $40,000 a year. She has two kids that live with her, and her son lives out of state. She's supporting her son from afar as well. So just someone whose story really kind of got to the heart of why Chicago is unaffordable today. And so real quick, we got in touch with her late last year and just kind of had some initial conversations. She was a little hesitant at first to participate in the story, but I think over time, as we just checked in, every couple of weeks, we built trust with her, and we were able. She was, generous enough to let us into her life and to kind of tell us about her finances and everything like that. So yeah, that's kind of how we found the main character for the story. Um, and then in terms of how we measured affordability, whether something is affordable, it depends on the person. The question is more kind of affordable to who, but a general rule of thumb is that apartment is affordable if your rent and utilities cost no more than 30% of your pre-tax income. And that comes from kind of like federal rules developed many, many years ago. But the idea is that if you spend more than 30%, you have a lot less money left over for your other necessities. And what the census reports is that nearly half of Chicago renters spend more than 30% of their rent on or sorry, their income on rent and utilities, and about a third of Chicagoans spend more than half of their income on rent and utilities. So if you're spending more than half, you're considered extremely rent burdened. If you're spending more than 30%, you're considered rent burdened. And so one question we had was, how do we determine how many rental apartments are affordable for each person at each income? And we were kind of limited by the information, the data that we had access to, because the data we had access to was median rent. And in some years, it wasn't just median rent and utilities, it was just your median contract rent, which is what is the number listed on your lease, and it doesn't include utilities. So we had to we worked with experts to kind of figure out a different threshold for just contract rent. So we used 25% of your pre-tax income instead of 30% for the years that we only had access to contract rent. Um, and the kind of way that we interpreted this information is that uh, your uh, the number of apartments that are affordable to you at each median rent level would be roughly half. So if you can afford the median rent in, say, one neighborhood at your income, that means that you can roughly afford about half of the apartments, and the other half would be unaffordable to you. So it's a little quirk that we kind of had to work with the data that maybe if you're just kind of reading through the story, you kind of gloss over. Um, but that's just like one thing we had to work around. We also kind of stress tested this with data from IPUMS citywide. Um, and sorry, I feel like I'm getting way too much in the weeds, but anyways, if people have questions, I'm happy to go through this more in depth. And the last thing I'll just say is that we did inflation adjust all of the numbers in the historical data to 2024 values. So I will be quiet and pass it off to Angela.
So I hope we can go into our Q&A time a little bit because we have the whole second part of this presentation to get through still. But thank you, Amy, so much for explaining our data collection process and analysis. It's been a real joy to work on this together. And from my perspective, when I first saw this data, like what clicked in my head was like, oh, can we adjust this for inflation? Because that's something that I always like try to reference back to get context on any sort of like money number that I see from the past. Like I think the CPI inflation calculator is one of my most visited pages. And then on the other side, can we put it together with like almost like a Zillow interface type of thing? Of course, that was a little too ambitious. But just to sort of give you an idea of like where our like thought process was when we were putting together the rent machine. And I'm gonna open this and let me know if you're because I'm sharing a different tab, I think. So I need to make sure that we're seeing the right thing. Looks good? Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Sweet. So I'm just gonna, for this demo, I'm gonna ask in the chat if you can suggest some um, monthly pre-tax incomes to put in here so we can like look into how the different how the like class boundaries of the city change. To me, that's really what it is. Okay, let's do 2,600, for example. Thank you, Lori. And then as you kind of change things around, you start to see like 1980 is a real turning point in terms of affordability. And then definitely you start to see like really like, oh, what happened? Huh, that's kind of interesting. And then you get to 2022 and it's like, okay, you can't really live anywhere on that kind of money in Chicago. Unless you have roommates or you want to be rent burdened. Can we get a different number? I'm gonna put in 4,000, more of like a middle class income. Um, and yeah, so this to me was particularly like interesting to almost like be able to see this like animation happen real time and start to explore like, okay, where is the visually you can sort of like see the unaffordability spreading. Reagan became president. That's what happened. I see that in the chat. Yeah, we can talk about that. But that's the demo. I hope you all can like play around with it. Also, don't forget that you can download the data below on the page. I will go back to our presentation really quickly. I don't know if you can, sorry. Let me stop sharing and reset. Okay, cool. Just really quickly want to go over the tech stack. But oh my God, I'm doing the same thing again. Tech stack. So to build the interactive, we have an Astro rig, which is like Astro is a JavaScript framework. And then in our main story, I primarily used Svelte D3 for the viz. And as you see, like Mapbox powers the main map. And another thing that we used was RTML to format the main bar copy. And I'm happy to kind of go more in depth with this more in depth about this. But we are short on time, and sort of to give you like the idea of like the back end, how we structured the data. It's a JSON that then match the community area numbers to the GeoJSON that the Chicago Data Portal publishes. And here you can see some of my early drafts. On the left is a Figma mock. And this is like when I was more ambitious about it, I was like, yes, I can get all these like newspaper clippings and classifieds. Uh, sorry, newspaper clippings and classifieds to sort of kind of be able to hover over it, but that's a much bigger project. If anyone's interested, I might want to follow up on it in that way. The very first prototype I like to, whenever I'm doing any kind of mapping, leaflet is just, it's quick, cheap, or free, so easy to set up, just sort of as like a proof of concept. And I just want to give everybody a little goodie tonight, because this is something that I learned on this project, is how easy it is to customize Mapbox base map, basically. And so we use the Mapbox free tier, which for a lot of purposes is totally fine. But essentially you take a screenshot of the map that you want to start with. So we started with one of the basic built-in base maps, and you edit it in Photoshop, and then you apply those same edits to a neutral LUT. Again, I can share that link. Mapbox has it too, but if you like Google Mapbox custom theme LUTs, you'll find more in-depth instructions. But this was like such a quick way to get it to match the rest of our theme. Okay, and then what's next? As I mentioned, you can download the data on our Chicago Rent machine, and you can make your own app with it. You can, enrich the data. So we made that accessible, and we plan to kind of update yearly with most recent rent data and inflation adjustment, obviously, as that changes. Yeah, so I tried to speed through this as much as possible, but now we can get to the Q&A. And okay.
All right. Thank you so much to our presenters, and we'll look forward to asking some of the questions that we've seen through the chat. And please, to our audience, continue to share questions as they arise. I'll shift my attention to our question sheet, and our first question is, what is included in utilities considered for affordability? Specifically, does it include internet?
That's a great question. I guess there was no documentation of what utilities included in some of the historical data we looked at. But it's the more modern data is based off of a census survey of kind of like a 1 in 100 sample of people over a 5-year period of time. And so it's kind of self-reported. So it is whatever you, the respondent, thinks your total utility bill is. So I imagine for some people it includes internet. For most people it includes internet. Yeah, that's a good question though.
All right. Thank you. Our next question is, DevOps person here, where is it hosted?
So Chicago Public Media, or BEZ, we host everything on AWS. So Amazon.
Okay, thank you. The next question, are you planning any follow-up reporting or analysis on this data, specifically wondering about comparing by race or ethnicity, also wondering about school data, what school attendance boundaries have become more or less affordable?
I like that idea of school boundaries. I didn't think about that. I'm sorry, Amy, you can take this one, but we've definitely this is part of a larger series that we're working on. But yeah, Amy, take it. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, that's exactly it. I did not think about school boundaries, but that is something I took a note of that we should look into. And yeah, it is kind of part of a broader series. So this first story is kind of uh setting the context for the problem, which is Chicago is the most unaffordable it's been in basically a century. And the following stories are going to get into different aspects of why. So we kind of gave some breadcrumbs as to why, supply and demand, lack of rent control, but I think we think there's more to the story, more to the picture. So we will be following up on this.
All right, we'll stay tuned and look forward to that. Thank you. The next question is, did you look into any historical data on home prices or rates of home ownership? Has the percentage of people who rent been going up or down?
I can take a stab at this. Lori, great questions, by the way. Thank you. You've given us lots of kind of story ideas here. We did not for this story. We wanted to focus on renters specifically, but home prices do impact rents, and I'd be interested to kind of explore the relationship between those two things. Has the percentage of people who rent been going up or down? I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think generally the percentages have trended upwards. Although I don't think it's super different today versus, 2 decades ago or even 5 decades ago. I think what's really interesting is how that's changed neighborhood by neighborhood. So I mentioned the South Loop, for example. In 1990, most people there were renters, like 80%. It was also a much smaller neighborhood. Less people lived there, but something flipped in the early 2000s and 2010s. And so today, half the people who live in the South Loop are homeowners. And the South Loop is now the third most expensive neighborhood in the city of Chicago. It used to be the 75th most expensive neighborhood out of 77 neighborhoods. And so there is probably something there in terms of the relationship between home ownership and rent. And maybe it differs a little bit based on where you are in the city. So that's a great question. But we did not look at historical home prices, although that is in the fact books. We were just, again, limited with what we could manually input for this project.
Great, thank you. I will read the next question here. What was most surprising to you in the data? Did you have any preconceived ideas that were wrong?
That was I didn't expect it to be like that affordable, I guess, across different incomes. Like that took me back because I was like, I think that we've gotten so used to rents being what they are and just like kind of see it as like, yep, half my income goes on rent. That's normal. Everybody else does it. Um, but to really kind of see that change happen over the last like 90 years, and also to see how it varied, like that was really like, wow. So it's not just about the avocado toast. It's about wages not keeping up with cost of living.
Yeah, no, I think I would say that too. Like, and I know that the data we have is a little bit of a lag. So, the 2022 data is actually based on a 5-year survey starting in 2018. So it's not really today's rent data. So I would be curious once the updated census data comes out, I believe next fall, what that picture looks like, because I would be curious to see what impact the like kind of post-pandemic era has had on rents. Just because as a renter myself, anecdotally and just personally, you see the lines for apartment showings, you see your rent go up. And so, yeah, I think maybe part of that is just the data being at a lag. But I think the other thing that was surprising to me was just how quickly neighborhoods changed over time. I keep mentioning the Southwood neighborhoods because it was just so shocking to me. But there are a number of other neighborhoods over time that have really flipped, and it kind of follows the trajectory of what we know about, segregation in Chicago, white flight. But if you look at, for example, Woodlawn in 1920, Woodlawn was, or not 1920, 1930, it was one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. And as you go past the 50s, as you see kind of essentially white flight, the impact of white flight, you see rental values go down. And now Woodlawn, I don't remember exactly, but it is still one of the more affordable communities in the city. So I think just the kind of up and down trajectories of neighborhoods was surprising to me.
All right, thank you. I'll ask the next question here. You mentioned the loss of missing middle housing, missing middle in quotes housing density. Did your data look at historical changes in unit size or multifamily building size? Is any different?
Um, yes, that's actually a great question. We did want to initially factor in unit size because that was something that was tracked in the fact books. But again, we didn't have time to collect all of that information. But what we did notice is that for certain kind of outer lying neighborhoods, rents were typically higher. And what we found just like looking up individual neighborhoods is that they typically were either the housing stock was different. So like bigger houses in you know far northwest side neighborhood compared to Hyde Park, for instance. Um, so I don't know if that answers the question. Apologies. I'm just reading the question again. But I think tracking kind of changes in unit size would be interesting too, in terms of just the question about like the loss of kind of dense housing in certain neighborhoods. Um,
All right,
yeah.
thank you. So next question is, could you see any obvious impacts from the changes in public housing during the last century?
I think Lincoln Park is an area that we look at a lot, for example, where we saw quite a big jump in rents, for example, and that was a site of public housing projects. So, but yeah, we didn't look into that specifically for this story. It is something we're looking at for the series. Amy.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, we were interested at one point, I think, in um not necessarily public housing, but actually, sorry, we were interested in, this is a different topic, but contract leasing, and the impact of that, and if we could see that on how that changed for rents. I don't know, Angela, if you want to talk a little bit more about that, but the public housing thing just kind of got me thinking about these little kind of one-offs that we were interested in, but didn't ultimately take too much of a deep look in terms of how rents have been impacted by that.
Yeah, so I'm glad we're doing this now too, just to sort of get a better idea of like what people are interested in. So this is super helpful. Thank you for all the questions. It gives us like, we do this for Chicago community, for people who live in our city. So thank you so much for like engaging and asking these questions.
Um, all right, thanks, y'all. Well, I'll note just that I think the Public Housing Museum just opened too, and someone can correct me in the chat if that's not the case. But The next question is around to follow up. What backend stuff are y'all using? Docker, Kubernetes, Lambda.
Product team mainly handles that part for us. So I mentioned earlier that we have this Astra rig set up. And so all like deployment and routing is preset, and I don't know that much about it to be quite honest. But yeah, so sorry I can't tell you more there, but
And I'll note in the chat there was a note about a book around CHA's history. There's another question around I'm from New Orleans. How we have a huge problem with Airbnbs. How has that impacted Chicago?
Great question. I think that's something we talked about wanting to follow up on. So I don't know exactly. I think we did at one point talk about trying to like scrape where Airbnbs were. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I think we'll follow up on that.
Another book related question here. To that point, any books you all recommend for housing history in Chicago, if you consulted any?
We did talk to Daniel K. Hertz, who is a great just housing expert in general, but he wrote a book called The Battle of Lincoln Park. Yes. So when we were focused on specific community area histories, we did read his book. We ultimately chose not to just focus on Lincoln Park. But I'm trying to think if there were any other books. I think that was the main book that I read for this project. There are other books that I didn't get to reading. One is Family Properties by Beryl Satter. She is the daughter of like a famous kind of housing tenant attorney. And she writes about kind of I'm kind of forgetting exactly the thesis of the book, but it's about racial segregation and how a lot of landlords used tactics like just letting properties fall into disrepair or other kind of like underhanded tactics to essentially segregate neighborhoods and drive out Black residents. So that one is on my reading list as well. I don't know, Angela, if you have any other books.
this is not Chicago specific, but Capital City by Samuel Stein has been super helpful to sort of chart some of the strategies and some of like the patterns that have been happening in like American cities over the past few decades. So, and I can put that in the chat.
Thanks, y'all, for sharing. We've got a lot of resources that folks can follow up with. We have, I think, like 3 more questions that we'll ask here. I think we're all right on time. What would you love to hear from people using this tool?
I mean, I think like just for me, like seeing the chat, seeing your guys' questions is really helpful and informative. I mean, anything, honestly, like I think specific examples of communities that I think you guys think are interesting, how this issue has impacted you personally, the other stories we kind of have lined up in the series deal more with property ownership. So if there are any ideas, leads, I think the Airbnb comment was really interesting. Yeah, I guess, sorry, I feel like I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, but Yeah, that's what it is for me. Angela, you probably has some more interesting
I guess
questions.
also that's been on my mind is like I'm a huge history nerd, so this project was super fun. Uh and it makes me wonder like what other, data point would be interesting to visualize over 90 years in Chicago? Like what would be helpful to see to kind of add some context to understanding the city today? As we're looking for data sources and making these tools also.
Um, thanks, y'all. I'll connect the last two questions here, and then I think we'll close. Do you feel like there is effective work being done to help counter affordability problems? And then the related, is this a solvable problem, like policy problem? What works?
Yeah, those are excellent, excellent questions. I don't know if I could answer them right now, because those are the same questions we're asking. So I forget the first question, but the second question, or Cameron, if you don't mind, just repeating what the first
Yeah,
question is.
I can repeat. Do you feel like there is effective work being done to help counter affordability problems?
Mm. Um, I think for one example is the rent control example. There have been multiple efforts to repeal the ban on rent control by different state legislators, and each of those efforts have kind of stalled in committee. Um, so I think there's a lot to it's a tough hill to climb, I think, in terms of just like the political support you need to pass legislation that's actually helpful for tenants. Um, there's been some interesting um, pieces of legislation in Chicago specifically. There's this kind of big bond for housing that Mayor Johnson passed a couple or late last year, and one of the uh, funding streams is for a social housing experiment in Chicago. So I think that's interesting. But I think a lot of these and I think with affordable housing too, one of the challenges is that it's like the problem is so big that when you solve it with just building like one, affordable housing apartment or, allocating funds to green social housing, you are providing affordable housing for a subset of people, but there are still thousands and thousands of people who there are not enough affordable units for. And I think there's different, I don't know, it's a political question as well, about if there needs to be a wholesale transformation of the rental market in and of itself, or if there these types of kind of tools in your toolbox in terms of policy can kind of etch away at the problem. So yeah, great questions. Um, don't have any straight up easy answers.
Yeah, it's a complex issue, but also I think it more so illustrates what are our priorities as a society right now. Like, where are our funds going? Where is our attention going? It's not going to housing as a human right. Our society doesn't prioritize it. Otherwise, everybody would be housed and we wouldn't be having this talk right now. And another thing that is a trend too that we didn't really touch upon, but it is part of a story that Amy and I did last fall, is on algorithmic tools that are used to set rent prices. So it essentially allows for collusion among many, many landlords. And that, we can attribute, I really do think that we can attribute the widespread adoption of these tools, like that is one of the reasons why rent has particularly exploded the last like couple of years, as these tools have gotten more adopted. And I'll put the link to the story that we did on RealPage specifically, which is one of these tools, to kind of give you a better idea. And yeah, Tenants Trap and Injustice Watch, we love that project, and we love what Injustice Watch is doing too. Definitely read look into that. I saw your comment, Lori. But yeah, that's kind of it for me. I think it would take a lot, but primarily like it would take like shifting our priorities and seeing that, you know, this is our responsibility as a society to house everyone.
Well, thank you so much, y'all, for a wonderful presentation and for covering a lot of ground, answering the questions. We are glad to learn more about the project, and we'll look forward to the next round of reporting. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
All right. Well, we'll now transition to the next portion of Shy Hack Night. And yeah, so